Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into something you've probably felt creeping into your everyday life, but maybe haven't quite been able to put your finger on. We're looking at the hidden forces shaping our modern crisis of trust. And listen, this isn't just your standard talk about politics or the economy. We're actually going to look at the fascinating, undeniable science of what happens to our bodies when trust breaks down, and how that is quite literally rewiring our entire world.
Here's our quick roadmap for today's Explainer. First, we've got the anatomy of trust. Then, a world retreating inward. Third, the institutional trust deficit. Fourth, the zero trust paradigm. And finally, rebuilding our connections.
Let me start by throwing a pretty profound question your way. What actually happens to us when trust just disappears? You know, we hear pundits throw around terms like low-trust societies all the time, right? But the breakdown of trust is way more than just a political talking point. It is a harsh biological reality. Because without trust, our bodies physically alter the way they interact with the world around us. To really grasp this, we kind of need to flip how we think about trust upside down. Based on 2025 research by Amalia Makarenko, trust isn't just a fleeting emotion or some rational choice we make. It's a deeply rooted bodily and neurophysiological function. Think of it as a biological imperative that acts like an internal radar for predicting safety. Without it, well, human survival and basic societal functions become practically impossible.
Okay, Section 1, the anatomy of trust. Let's look at the brain.
Look at the contrast here. It's wild. When we feel safe, our brain is humming along on trust. Your prefrontal cortex is engaged, which allows for rational thought, empathy, and social connection. Plus, the ventral vagus nerve is active, sending these nice, calming signals of safety all throughout your body. But contrast that with the traumatized brain. Severe trauma actively suppresses that rational prefrontal cortex, and your amygdala, which is basically your brain's threat detector, goes into absolute overdrive. Your neuroceptive systems start constantly reading false signals of danger. In this hyper-vigilant state, trust isn't just difficult, it's biologically impossible. Your nervous system literally shuts it down to protect you.
And here's the kicker. This biological rewiring doesn't just stay trapped inside our heads. It ripples outward across three major levels. First, on the intrapersonal level, a traumatized person experiences deep fear and self-denial. They essentially lose trust in their own experiences. That scales up to the interpersonal level, creating severe alienation and a deep suspicion of our neighbors and peers. And finally, it reaches the systemic level. That's when you see a profound feeling of powerlessness and total sweeping distrust of the rules, norms, and institutions that actually govern our society.
Moving right along to Section 2, a world retreating inward.
So the data on this is honestly staggering. According to the 2026 Edelman Trust Barometer, which surveyed tens of thousands of people across the globe, a massive 70% of people worldwide are unwilling or at least highly hesitant to trust someone who has different values, facts, or a different cultural background. Think about that. Faced with intense economic and geopolitical anxiety, 7 in 10 people have retreated into an insular mindset. It acts as this massive societal defense mechanism. It's exactly like that hyperactive amygdala we just talked about, but on a global scale.
And this builds into a much deeper fracture. Just look at this number, 29. As of the 2026 Edelman report, there is a massive 29-point trust gap between high-income and low-income groups in the United States alone. And this mass-class divide has more than doubled globally since 2012. It's a perfect demonstration of how economic vulnerability accelerates that systemic loss of trust. We are essentially living in two entirely different realities of how safe and reliable the world feels.
Which brings us to Section 3, the institutional trust deficit.
Just take a look at the sheer imposing scale of something like the European Parliament. According to data from Eurofound, this massive scale and complexity is actually a huge part of the problem. Citizens often feel deeply alienated by institutions that seem incredibly distant, massive, and completely disconnected from their daily realities, especially when you compare them to local or national governments. The vastness of it all just makes it so much harder for our brains to register these institutions as safe or understandable.
And context is everything here. Eurofound research points out that right after the 2008 economic shocks of the Great Recession, trust in political systems became incredibly volatile. This was super apparent in Southern and Eastern Europe, where governments were heavily struggling with debt and unemployment. In a lot of those regions, trust simply never bounced back to pre-crisis levels. That major shock to the system left a lingering, systemic distrust that we're still dealing with today.
Let's pivot to Section 4, the zero trust paradigm.
Now, the evolution of zero-trust architecture in technology is absolutely fascinating. It actually kicked off back in 1994 when Stephen Paul Marsh coined the term in his doctoral thesis, arguing that trust is this finite mathematical concept. Fast forward to 2010, John Kindervag popularizes the model for corporate networks. And then boom, by 2021, it becomes so critical that U.S. Executive Order 14028 actually mandates its use across all federal agencies. So what started as this niche theoretical computer science concept has morphed into a mandatory framework for global cybersecurity.
The entire ethos of this architecture boils down to one simple, pretty intense rule. Never trust, always verify. Zero-trust architecture completely throws out the old idea of a safe corporate perimeter. It just assumes that threats are literally everywhere, even already inside the network, and that every single request has to be dynamically verified every time. Do you see the parallel here? This is the exact technological equivalent of the traumatized, hyper-vigilant human brain. Our computer networks are now directly mirroring our societal anxiety.
Finally, Section 5, Rebuilding Our Connections.
So how do we fix this? Well, to move forward, we really have to merge the biological with the societal. From a psychological standpoint, Makarenko's research shows that we absolutely have to restore polyvagal safety, meaning we have to create regulated, predictable environments where our nervous systems can actually feel safe to relax again. To pull that off on a societal scale, the Edelman Trust Barometer argues that we need institutions to step up and act as trust brokers, intentionally building spaces where that biological safety can be restored.
And who's best equipped to do this? Well, surprisingly, according to the data, it's employers. Employers currently hold the highest performance scores when it comes to trust. To be effective trust brokers, they need to focus on engaging people right where they are. That means really prioritizing listening without judgment, helping to translate different realities between polarized groups, and rolling out robust conflict resolution training. It's all about slowly rebuilding that predictability and safety day by day, right there in the workplace.
We've covered some serious ground in this explainer today, haven't we? Going all the way from the amygdala firing inside our brains out to global economic divides and straight into the cybersecurity frameworks protecting our data. Which leaves me with one final, pretty provocative thought for you to chew on. In a world that is increasingly built on a digital and societal architecture of zero trust, who will you actively choose to trust today? Because rebuilding our connections, it doesn't start with governments or algorithms. It starts with you. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.